or good morning. My name is Brian Silverman. I'm the ISO Group Sales and Marketing Leader. For all of your information, we are going to record this webinar for playback, and you can all, hopefully, if you need to refer back to it or you have other members of your team who'd like to hear this, they can see it in replay. If for some reason you have a challenge with us recording, you can drop it this time. The other thing is we are going to have a dynamic session today. I want to thank you for attending our webinar, Taming the FHIR of Healthcare with IBM's API Connect. I'm joined today by Cheryl Bertini, who's the ISO Group COO, and Brian Kataoka, who's our Chief Technology Officer and our FHIR evangelist, who's going to talk to you a little bit more in detail about FHIR and the importance along with IBM's API Connect. If you have any questions, you can certainly put them in the chat room here, and myself and the team will be monitoring it. If you please do that for everyone so we can see it and all build this dialogue and community together, that would be greatly appreciated. FHIR, as you'll hear from Brian, is a really great initiative to help healthcare companies work together, and we're delighted to be working with IBM and working with many of you on this call to help you build the foundation for digital innovation. If you're not familiar with ISO Group is a commerce solutions company that's been in business for over 21 years. Our focus has continued to be to leverage technology to help companies realize true business innovation. Since our beginning, we've been an IBM business partner working together on integration technologies such as data power, API management, and various integration and application server capabilities. Brian Kataoka, who you'll be hearing from in just a moment, wrote a Bible on webs for application server. So we've been working in this area around integration and bringing this kind of technology and business value together for quite a while. ISO Group provides great service and long-term relationships with our clients, and along with that, we can resell and implement the full solution with IBM. As you can see some of our core competencies here, it'll give you some understanding of the foundation that we come together to help you support your environment and build digital innovation. Next slide, please. As an example, Brian and the team has presented more than 10 times at different IBM conferences along with our clients to talk about the best practices and ways to use technology such as data power and API management. We've helped support the development of certification tests. We're presenting at the tech conference coming up shortly, and we continue to be recognized as one of the first data power partners, and truthfully one of the leading API Connect and API management deployment partners for IBM. We have over 14 years of experience with data power since IBM's acquisition, and help train some of the IBM teams on the best practices for sales and implementation, and making sure that showing our full support for the IBM community. And most importantly for today, we've already helped customers implement FHIR and API management, and that's why we're here to talk with you this afternoon or this morning. Again, thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, put them in the chat room and we'll respond and at the end of this webinar. Brian, please take it away.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. As Brian mentioned, I'm the other Brian Kataoka with the ISO Group. And we're going to get started by talking about what is FHIR. Other than being kind of a fun name to kind of as an acronym to keep using it for things like starting a fire and all that. What does it really stand for? It stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. And primarily, you know, what happens in FHIR is it's all about exchanging clinical information. And the way it exchanges this information is a thing called resources. And I'll be going through a little bit more about what resources are. The other thing about FHIR is it's supporting various, I want to call them contexts or paradigms of how to utilize FHIR in various implementations. And then the other thing about FHIR, it's not something that's just started up. It's been in the works for some time now, and it's actually a real community effort. FHIR isn't just limited to the US, it's actually worldwide. And there's a lot of vendors around, there's a lot of people contributing to the community and trying to make the overall FHIR spec better. So it's something that it's a lot of healthcare organizations are looking toward, and it's more not a question of when, but it's sort of happening now. So there's a lot of things on the plate right now that are making FHIR become more prominent. Okay, so let me move forward. So as I mentioned, there's various ways of looking at FHIR. You know, this particular discussion is going to be focused on how to use it, you know, with apps and using the IBM's API Connect product. But there are other ways to look at it. So in this diagram, you might see that there's on the left-hand side, we've got previous versions of HL7, version 2, right, which supported segments. Then version 3, which was the XML-related version. And then you might have some kind of conversion or ESB or a message broker that would take these messages and actually help convert it into the FHIR structure, right? So that's kind of one way of looking at it. The center one is the one in the red. That's what we're focusing on today, is how do you take and create APIs where you're getting, you know, health records, and you're using the FHIR specification APIs to support the exchange of that information. Another way you can also do it is if you have your, you know, you want to go to FHIR and you have data that you want to convert into FHIR formats. And that might be something that you use internally, or maybe that you're sharing. So those are just different ways of looking at it. So when I talk about FHIR with you know, customers, it's like, okay, well, which one are you looking to support, right? Okay. So as I mentioned, the resource is kind of the key thing of FHIR. And what is a resource? Well, it's basically, think of it as a building block, okay? It is the smallest unit of a clinical piece of information that you would want to send out or share, right? Now, inside this definition, right, it's got, you know, identity, right? So it kind of says, here's what I almost think of it as like a kind of a C++ object or a Java object. It has its own life, and it has an identity, okay? It has a location of where you would find this, and it's a part of a small transaction. So we'll be exchanging patient resource or an observation or a diagnostic report. These are things that you can share across entities, right? And as you figure out how you want to do it based on that previous picture I showed, then you can start building out the FHIR resources, okay? And again, it supports this interaction between healthcare related issues. So anything between clinical or administration. Now our little cloud there on the bottom kind of talks about how FHIR resources is comprised, right? So there's some metadata, right? There's some descriptive narrative in there that talks about the resource. There are elements that are representing that particular resource, of which you can also extend. So again, it's a pretty well defined set of specifications, okay? And there, again, there's a process to go through and determine which resource you're going to be wanting to use. And if you go to the HL7 side, you'll be able to identify the ones that are currently, you know, in a draft mode, and others that are moving farther along, okay? So I talked about the paradigms. So these are the way of, you know, exchanging the information. So you have various methods, okay? FHIR is primarily focused, at least when most people talk about it, is using the REST format, but it goes beyond that, right? And there's other ways of exchanging the information. You know, there's still documents out there The previous versions of HL7 was all message based. So just because they went to FHIR and say we're going with FHIR doesn't mean that those facilities and those mechanisms still don't work. They're a part of FHIR also. And then there are a number of services that you can expose, okay, or you can invoke them. So these are the 4 interoperability paradigms or contexts that, so depending on what your organization is attempting to do, you may choose one or many of these, right? Again, our conversation today is more about going with the REST implementation of it, but still under the covers, there could be other things that are integrating with our REST implementation. So if I were to look at these paradigms and compare, you know, our background is with IBM products, you know, there are 3 products that seem to align themselves up very well with the FHIR specification and, you know, working with Smart on FHIR. So in the older versions of HL7, a part of the exchange of information was using FTPs, and one product that if you're still in that mode and you're still going to send FHIR information via some mechanism like an FTP, you can certainly use something that IBM has called a SPARA, which actually improves the response of the FTP. It's a very high performance component that you can utilize. I also mentioned in the other paradigms there's messagings. So again, there's a product called Event Streams that is based on Kafka, again, which is another messaging type facility. And then one that we're going to talk about today is API Connect. API Connect is an API management system that provides a lot of functionality. And I'm going to go through some of that functionality and how it maps to implementing with FHIR, because you get some additional things that normally when you're talking about FHIR, you're not thinking of that at the time, but I think they're valuable going forward. Okay, so a little bit about API Connect. API Connect is built on open standards, and right now it's running containers, the Docker containers, and it's managed by Kubernetes, and actually orchestrated by Kubernetes and managed by a thing called Helm. And then there's a Terraform also for doing provisioning. But again, all of this is open standards, and API Connect not only will run on-premise, but it can run in other clouds. So AWS or Azure, or may run in multiple clouds as well as on-premise. So that's where some of the benefit comes in with API Connect, because maybe all the FHIR resources aren't coming from one location. You might have a set of smaller, let's say taking laboratories as an example, you might have, you know, the main lab, and then you might have a number of specialty labs who've created things, and that's where the data is living. And then you can actually implement it, the fact that you can have pull the FHIR resources from various locations. And as customers start looking for moving from off-premise and taking advantage of cloud technology, the nice thing about API Connect is you can kind of lift it up and shift it into a new environment. So all of this open standard with Docker and Kubernetes makes it very strategic for your organization as you start growing. Okay. Other open standards, obviously you've got OpenID Connect, Open API, sorry, which used to be called Swagger. And then you have the FHIR specifications. Okay, so there's a lot of information on the web on how to use these things, and I'm sure you can talk to us or IBM if you're interested in exploring more about API Connect. Okay, so as I mentioned, you know, these were the key enablers using these products. API Connect obviously provides all of the REST service capabilities that I spoke about in FHIR. So there's things that you can do, such as security. So one of the things that if you look at the Smart on FHIR specifications, things that you want to do, one of them is OAuth 2, another one is OpenID Connect. API Connect supports client ID and secret for creating apps and securing them. And then there's other things that you could do with API Connect with the security. So it's not just security coming in from a client, but maybe you have internal security. So as you're calling your backend services that are building the secure resources, and you can also add other types of security to that. Okay, and in terms of doing messages and service and exchanging documents, you have event streams and Aspera. But we'll save that for another presentation to talk about how that might be implemented. Okay, so let me take those 4 things that we just listed there and talk a little bit about it. So API Connect, when you talk about security for FHIR, again, I mentioned already, it supports OAuth 2, OpenID Connect obviously has the TLS and SSL implementations, as well as generating a client secret. And then there's, again, like I mentioned, there's other things you can do secure-wise with API Connect. And then from an API side, it's using OpenAPI. So you have the ability to create API definitions or new APIs, and you can basically model it and extend that API to conform to whatever the particular partner that you're working with that wants to expose and exchange information, FHIR information. So you might have something as simple as just a simple API call that makes a call to the back end that brings back a bundle of FHIR resources. Okay, so there's a lot of things you could do in API Connect. It's a web-based kind of interface and has all the functionality, even has kind of a drag and drop assembly thing where you can add additional actions. Okay. The other thing that you get with API Connect that really isn't talked about when you talk about FHIR is all of the management capabilities. And you're going to need this management capabilities if you are basically exposing your FHIR APIs and you want to do metrics on it. So there's a couple things that first thing that comes to mind is you have a developer portal. So let's say you've built in a set of FHIR resources that you are going to be able to have others consume. Well, how do those people get to those resources? Well, the first thing they're going to have to do is go to your developer portal and be able to kind of check out your inventory and see that what you have. And then from that point on, they can say, hey, I would like to create an app and I would like to get my client ID and secret. And this is one way of, making your organization stand out. So they can come there and say, hey, I want to be able to integrate with you. And in the portal, it will tell you how you can do that integration. You'll even have a test facility where you can say, hey, I want to run a quick test to see if I can get my FHIR resource back. Okay, the other things is how you want to package your resources, okay? Even though, FHIR's got the specification for doing, these resources, you might want to package them differently, okay? So that is what you get when you do products. So you can take your APIs and you can bundle them under a product. So they can look for a particular product that they're interested in and say, hey, this API has the FHIR resources I would like to get, because maybe they're all not the same. Okay, it might be divided by kind of clinical things. So you can say, I want to look at these products, and then from within that product, you can say, hey, there is a plan. Basically, it might be all you can eat APIs and use them as much as you want, or maybe you can limit them. Okay, so again, your organization will look at it and say, hey, how do I want to expose my APIs, and do I want to set my plans where it's, anyone can get in and run as many transactions, or do you want to, if you want to charge for them, you certainly could do that too. So it depends on how you want to do it within this API economy. The other thing that you get with the management side is analytics, okay? So as you're exposing your APIs, your management team is going to want to know, well, how well is this working? Are people subscribing? Are we getting a lot of hits? Are we, actually building market share because people are coming to us to get their FHIR resources from your company? Okay, so you get that as analytics right there, but also the people who are building the apps also get analytics, because maybe they've built a special mobile app that says, hey, I'm pulling information from various laboratories or whatever, and saying, hey, I want to see how well people are using my apps. So that analytics is also available to the consumers. Final thing is how to use the APIs within an app so that you can put your API documentation in there, as well as I said already, there's a testing facility. So this management component is one thing that's I see is currently missing when we have a lot of the discussions about FHIR and exposing to rest. So this is a critical piece. And then finally, doing the resources. Again, with API Connect, you can then manage things like routing. As I mentioned, you might have your FHIR resources on multiple environments. So maybe in multiple clouds, maybe on premise, and maybe there's some transformation that needs to go on depending on how you got it crafted. So again, with API Connect, a call could come in and they could then interrogate and say, oh, well, this particular resource is found in this cloud, and then it could point out to a different cloud. Or it could say, well, this is part on the cloud and another piece is on the on-premise. So again, by having API Connect, you can then manage the routing and then make sure it gets to the right place. Okay, so that's how API Connect and FHIR kind of come together. Okay, so I'm going to go dig deeper a little bit into each of those. So in terms of security, right, I already mentioned that it supports SSL, TLS, does the OAuth 2, and it supports the scopes that are required when you're doing FHIR. It provides kind of the app protection as well as the various types of OAuth, right? Whether you're being called from a browser, kind of a public one, or whether it's coming from kind of a server to server, so you can do confidential apps that way too. In the end, you register all of this within API Connect. Okay, so it's one consolidated place to go. And then again, as I mentioned, that when you actually call, I mean, API Connect is sitting in front and doing your API definitions and helping to manage all that other information. When it does call a backend where the resources are located, and maybe that's where you're generating the resources, within API Connect security, you can actually do some token switching. So as you come in with an OAuth from a user side, maybe on the back end you're running a .NET facility or whatever, and you want to say anyone who calls internally making a call to this service must use Kerberos or something. Within API Connect, then you can do that switching as well as other types of tokens that you want to switch. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff within there, as well as exchanging JOT tokens or creating them. Okay, so security-wise, it's API Connect lives on top of what was used to be called Data Power, still called Data Power, but in API Connect we just refer to as the gateway. Okay, and again, it's one of the most secure gateways out there. All right, in terms of doing the API definition, so now you're taking an API using the Open API, the specification there, and then you will be supplementing that with any kind of other additional logic or security within the definition. So this is going to be able to support the multiple method calls for REST, and then from that you're able to utilize the ability to route to different clouds if that's what is necessary, right? So again, it's all open standards, so anything that you can actually take a YAML or Swagger file that you've created on your own and import that into API Connect and be able to make the appropriate changes without impact. Okay. In terms of the management, I talked about this a lot already, but again, from a FHIR resource standpoint and understanding your ability to expose these APIs, you get all this additional functionality and features that you can take advantage of. Okay, again, analytics is a real big one. I mean, you're going to want to know how well and how many times someone is making a call and how well you're ability to expose these FHIR resources, improving your company visibility. Supports versioning, so you're able to keep multiple APIs versions running, okay, and you can use a life cycle to make sure that if you do have changes, you can maintain a life cycle of deprecating something and keeping it alive for those who need a little bit more time to make a change if you do have a change. There's things, like I said, rate limiting. So maybe you want to either charge for your API calls, or maybe you might have a backend that you just don't want it to get hit too hard. Maybe it's kind of a legacy backend that you can say, hey, I want to limit the number of calls right now so I don't kind of overload anything on the backside. So that's also there. As well as you get now ability to do documentation. No more sending documentation via email. You just say, hey, go to the portal, sign up with us, subscribe to create your APIs, and right there will be the documentation. And then, hey, while you're there, why don't you go ahead and do a quick test, and they can run a quick test. And then that's where they will get their client IDs and secrets generated. So that's all part of that portal that is provided with API Connect. And then finally, as I mentioned, to do your FHIR resources, there may be the need to do some type of manipulation. Okay, normally it's going to be done with another like IBM product like IB that does the brokering. So you might be taking maybe existing version 2 or version 3 formatted HL7 and then moving that into FHIR, so that using something like a broker is probably a better. But again, you can do some simple things with the FHIR resources on API Connect, but primarily this would be more for routing and any kind of other things that you need to add specifically for your transactions. Okay, so putting it all together, I like this little saying that Jerry Brown, he former governor of where I live, the reason that everybody likes planning is nobody has to do anything. Well, a lot of this presentation is all about planning, and I think it's really important as you start moving into FHIR that you have to plan, right? You have to get ready for these things, and by introducing API Connect, I've given you an opportunity to kind of look at some of the other things that you might want as you're planning to go with kind of a RESTful-based FHIR implementation, right? You can write everything in code, or you can utilize something like API Connect that provides you this already, okay? Our plans in terms of how you would go about doing an implementation is we generally say, hey, start with a workshop to kind of understand your vision, right? Understand the requirements you have, what kind of capabilities do you have already, what tooling do you have, right? And then make sure you get your infrastructure set up to support FHIR. I mean, you can again, it depends on which paradigm you're working on, but I'm assuming you're doing REST here. So if you're doing REST, then you have to really consider an API management system to help you along with that. And then determine where your resources are going to be generated from, right? Are they on cloud? Are they on premise? Are they in both? Okay, so look into that. And then finally, I think, start small, right? A simple Spark to enable FHIR, so something easy to get going with so that you can get everything in order that you need to do to support FHIR. Okay, so to summarize, just so everyone remembers, okay, there's 4 paradigms. All of these things support FHIR. So there's RESTful implementation. So you're using APIs to exchange and expose this information. There were documents, there were messages and services. All of those are supported by FHIR. In terms of API Connect, in terms of security and Smart on FHIR authentication, API Connect is there to help you with that, as well as enhancing other things in terms of routing and transformation and providing you all of the things that you get with the developer portal. So you get things like client ID secrets, products, doing plans, the analytics. And then after that, I think we say start planning now. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Brian.
Well, Brian, thank you very much. I think this was very good. I always remember what you tell me, and that is when you talk to clients, you hear a lot about FHIR, and they don't say if, it's a matter of when they get engaged. And I think part of it is by using APIs and the standard support that you talked about, it makes it easier for companies who are either trying to integrate their own health management applications or are looking to add resources or partner with other companies and bring those together into applications, whether it's sitting on your wrist in a smartphone or maybe in a tablet or wherever the patient or the clinician might be. So that's great. We have a few questions. Are you up for a few questions before we end the call?
Sure.
So Jay asked, do you have any advice around the clinical reasoning module of FHIR, and any thoughts about special support that might be needed or that we can provide?
Not off the top of my head right now, Brian, but what I can do is I can, at the end of this call, I can, if I can get the email address, I can respond back to him, and then we can have a conversation about that.
So Jay, we will get back to you after the call, and we'll share information when we send out the replay information. We'll send out a little bit of an explanation for everyone. I'm sure they would want to know that as well. And then Ravi asked, any thoughts about heavy lift transformation of data via API Connect?
Well, if you're going to do a lot of transformations, you know, my old days of data power, which I'm dating myself. Obviously, the data power appliance is extremely fast in doing transformations, but it depends on the type of transformations, right? If you are it may not be in API Connect that you do this transformation, but again, API Connect is using data power as a gateway, and you can actually have an internal gateway. That might even be the normal setup where you have the API Connect gateways in the DMZ for external folks. But if you're just only doing it internally, you can also have the gateway internally, of which you can use the gateway facilities. So if you're taking version 3 HL7 and you're saying, hey, I need to convert it into FHIR JSON, you can actually do that with data power. And it's a little bit more, I wouldn't say complex. It's going to be faster to do in terms of performance of the transformation. But again, like I mentioned, otherwise there's other tools such as you know, IIB, formerly IIB, I think it's ACE now, that has the healthcare pack, of which you'll be able to do those kinds of conversions. And that's kind of that broker model that I mentioned of the various ways that you can implement the FHIR.
Okay. And let me see if we have any other questions. I had one that I'd heard about, and that was, do you see using FHIR more for external connectivity, or do you see it more for internal use as well between different maybe healthcare departments or payers or providers?
It can go either way, Brian. You know, it depends on, again, what you're doing. So if you are exposing, if your company has some unique capability that wants to expose these resources out, and maybe there's a app developer that says, hey, I want to collect this information. For instance, let's say that you're taking care of, you know, an elderly parent or something, and someone comes up with an app that says, hey, I want to be able to get into this app and be able to look at, you know, how well my parents are being taken care of in you know, the hospital. You know, maybe what are they getting served for food, or what kinds of medication. Something like that would be a great implementation, because I know a lot of people that I know that actually have that situation. They say, well, it would be great if I could just get on an app and see what's going on versus always having to run down to the hospital and try to find, a practitioner to say, hey, can you talk to me about these things? I'd like to see what's going on. That would be nice. Now, if you're just doing it internally and maybe you have requirements by statutory requirements to send information to a state organization, maybe there's immunization records or something that need to be recorded and sent out somewhere. Again, that might be just a situation where you do it internally, and then you just use one of the facilities, whether it be something like a SPHIR, to say, hey, I'm going to shoot it all off to state of California. Here's all the records that we have so far. Okay.
Great. So another question is, Ankit1 asks, do you have any recommendations for translating a proprietary object to FHIR resource? For example, a payer organization has a member object and it wants to translate it to FHIR patient.
That's more of a transformation situation. So it depends on what the format is of the proprietary one. In some cases, if it's XML, then it's just a mapping exercise. If it's flat file or something like that, you might want to go with something like an IIB, which has more of these nodes that can do various file formats and do the conversion. Do that along with the healthcare pack.
Okay. And then Ravi had a second question about if there's anything like a healthcare pack as it is for IIB for API Connect. I think you sort of answered that earlier, but I just wanted to, Ravi, if there's anything additional that Brian didn't cover, you can either ask it now or we can certainly follow up with you after the webinar as well. Are there any additional questions? I'm sorry.
Can you guys hear? Yeah, I'm Ravi. Sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So on the healthcare pack, what I was trying to understand is, do we have any modules? To be honest, I might have missed when Brian was explaining about it. So the reason I was asking that is there anything on API-C which can help us increase the productivity considering healthcare space or the industry for HL7 or FHIR? I mean, I understand the tool could support it in terms of API Connect supporting it, but do we have any specific packs, healthcare pack?
No, the healthcare pack doesn't run on API Connect, but if this is the Ravi that I know, yes, and you have, I think, IIB, which has that healthcare pack.
So yeah, I mean,
integration between the two is fairly easy in terms of API Connect calling that the IIB.
Correct. The thing which we are working on right now, IIB is not an option in the space, technology landscape, right? So that's the reason I was wondering if we could get something at the API management there.
Let's talk about it afterwards, Ravi. And
sure.
I probably can actually bring in some of our IBM friends too, who may have a little bit more details on what's coming in API Connect, if there's anything like that.
Sure.
And I know how to reach you.
That's true.
Okay, great.
Well, if there are no other questions, then I want to thank you all for your time. And on behalf of Cheryl and Brian, we hope to work with all of you to, as we say, tame the fire. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.